Okay, so we are on the play here, and this hand is interesting. We don't have a colored source besides the Fetid Heath. Hmm. We could hope to draw one. Alternatively, we could Ghost Quarter our own land. I think this hand has a lot of upside. I'm going to keep it. Because if we immediately do draw a colored source, we can go Tidehollow Scholar into 3-drop. And the Fetid Heath means that just one colored land means that we can cast these Flicker Wisps. So it looks like we are playing against Dredge here. So kept a little bit of a risky one, not gonna lie. And now our opponent... our opponent has probably a reasonable draw, assuming that they have a Dredge card, and it looks like Life from the Loam is going to get dredged here. So on our next turn, we can sacrifice our Ghost Quarter on our own land to find a basic. It's not what we would like to be doing by any means, but it's an option. And it could be that we should have mulliganed this hand. I think it's debatable. Obviously, drawing this Tidehollow Scholar was not what we wanted. So now we found a copy of Shambling Vent. So we can actually just put that into play here. I think that's fine. Our opponent clearly has gas in hand, and Dredge isn't a great matchup. I don't think we're in any rush, per se. So we're just going to pass. And our opponent's going to dredge a Life from the Loam here. So I would suspect that the Bloodghast and the Prized Amalgam are going to come back here. And it looks like our opponent has even more gasoline to discard here. A second copy of Prized Amalgam is pretty punishing. Not to mention that we know our opponent has a Life from the Loam already in hand. So that Loam is just going to get cast to get back that Stomping Ground. And now the Amalgams are going to return. And here's a copy of Path to Exile. So we certainly can path away one of these Amalgams, and I think that's actually the play. So what we can do here is we can make white-black and go for a Path to Exile on a Prized Amalgam, and then follow up with a Wasteland Strangler. And we can now, if we want to, strangle away one of these creatures, but I don't think we do want to. It's pretty weird, but we don't want that Prized Amalgam in our opponent's graveyard. So we're just going to let it stay exiled. So we'll see what our opponent has here. Could be Conflagrate. Looks like a Faithless Looting. So the looting is going to get back a Grave Troll. And we see our opponents actually playing Raven's Crime in their deck. That's pretty unusual, a pretty unusual card choice. We're basically drawing here to try to find Relic of Progenitus and hope that that's going to be enough. Without it, I don't think we're going to be able to mount a comeback here. Now after board, we also get Rest in Peace for the matchup, so we definitely have cards that are good here. But here's another Bloodghast. So just going to take this hit here. And this could be a... Well, we'll see what this is in a moment. Looks like it's actually going to be a Raven's Crime. So we can pitch a Tidehollow Scholar to that. And our draw here is a Caves of Koilos. Not really what we wanted, but we're going to send in the Wasteland Strangler. And we can go ahead and get a Flicker Wisp into play, flickering out our Wasteland Strangler, which is a pretty neat trick. And then I think we may want to try to blow up this Blood Crypt that our opponent has. We'll see if our opponent has another basic to search up or not. Looks like the answer is no. So our Strangler is going to come back here, and we can put this Faithless Looting back into our opponent's graveyard, and it seems like it's worth it. So now we've actually got two bodies in play, and we cut off our opponent's black mana, but our opponent does still have a Conflagrate in the graveyard, which is going to be problematic. Because if our opponent wants to flash that Conflagrate back, both of our creatures could be sent to the bin. And we see here that our opponent's got a few different decisions. There's loams, there's lootings, there's all sorts of stuff that our opponent could potentially do here. So our opponent is going to dredge here, and a Narcomoeba is what has been found. And it looks like also a Prized Amalgam and another Bloodghast. So that's probably just going to put a wrap on the game. This Narcomoeba is going to come back. Now we see the Prized Amalgam trigger. And our opponent's got 6 cards in hand. So our opponent's been able to go through the majority of their deck in this game. And here's a Life from the Loam. But I suspect that those lands are going to be... Well, one of them may be used to get back this Bloodghast. But the rest may be used for a Conflagrate. And that's a big issue. So yep, here's what I suspect is going to be a game-ending Conflagrate. So our opponent can discard 3 cards, it looks like, Those are going to get rid of our creatures. Now a land can come down if our opponent wants to after dealing us 4. Gets back a Bloodghast. And we are in a really rough shape. The Prized Amalgam comes back. So yeah, that's just going to do it here. Onto the sideboard. A lot of times Dredge is going to win game 1, but we've got some options after board. So the Rest in Pieces are obvious. That's our best card in the matchup. Worship is also another option we can look to. Although our opponent does have Conflagrate, so it may just not be what we want. Aether Vial. It's a card we can shave on. Looking at cards like Finks, cards like Reality Smasher, I think we would rather have Smasher than Finks here. Strangler also doesn't seem that great because there's not that many creatures we want to actually get rid of. We saw that last game. And maybe that we actually want a Thoughtseize, as weird as that is. And the Forge Tender can stop Conflagrate, so that actually seems like a card we might want. And Wasteland Strangler is fine, but I think we can shave on some. So yeah, let's see how this goes for us. Game 2. And Dredge, unfortunately with Dredge, sometimes you just get those types of games that we saw where the game just wasn't all that interesting. We just got kind of blown out and there wasn't much we could do. And that's kind of, Dredge is kind of one of those decks. It normally blows another player out, or if you have a hate card, then the game is very different. So we're hoping to have something like a Rest in Peace here. And unfortunately we don't. This hand is not bad though. So it's close. I don't think we can afford to mulligan to a specific hate card, so we are going to keep this and just hope that our opponent doesn't have a great hand, and we can go turn 2 Displacer, turn 3 Flicker Wisp, turn 4 Reality Smasher. We can do that all. Our hand allows us to do all of that. So that's why we're keeping it. We could actually potentially win with just a regular Magic hand rather than having any way to interact with the graveyard. Although it looks like our opponent does have a turn 1 Neonaut. And there's a Leonin Arbiter, but I think we just want to get this Displacer into play on turn 2. And we'll think about whether we want to play the Arbiter on our next turn or not. If we do draw another Tempo, we could actually play a turn 3 Smasher, but we're seeing like game 1, our opponent dredge a Life from the Loam here, find a Stinkweed Imp off the Dredge, so now our opponent can dredge the Imp, which is what we should be expecting here. And this is how the Dredge deck works. I mean, you have Neonaut or Looting are basically the best starts of the deck, but I actually think Neonaut's the best start, and our opponents had it game 1 and now had it here. And we're seeing our opponent already filling up the graveyard with cards like Prized Amalgam, multiple Dredgers, and now the Life from the Loam allows our opponent to keep their hand stocked, essentially full of gas. But we did draw a Tidehollow Sculler, which is an interesting draw. So we can get in here for 3, and then we have a bit of a decision in terms of what we want to do here. We can cast the Scholar. We can also just play a Flicker Wisp or an Arbiter. I don't know that we actually want to cast the Tidehollow Scholar here. It is a pretty close decision, though. Flicker Wisp hits a bit harder than Scholar does. Most likely next turn we're going to want to play the Smasher, although it's not 100%. Alright, well, I think we definitely want to try to stop our opponent from dredging into Conflagrate, but on the other hand, if our opponent simply hits a Narcomoeba, Narcomoeba can block Flicker Wisp pretty effectively. So I think we go with the Scholar here. Let's try the Scholar out. We'll see what our opponent's working with. So we see an Amalgam, an Imp, and then 5 lands. So yeah, we're just going to take the prized Amalgam here and pass the turn. So we've actually got a pretty nice turn, next turn, set up for us with just playing a Reality Smasher, and our opponent does have the Narcomoeba. So pretty happy, actually, that we went with the Scholar plan, but we see that our opponent has gotten pretty lucky to find the Conflagrate here. And that Conflagrate can potentially just sweep our board. And if that is the play our opponent goes with, that's going to be a problem. We also, this prized Amalgam in our opponent's graveyard is also going to potentially be coming back here since our opponent has found a Narcomoeba, and we don't have the ability to activate our Eldrazi Displacer with only essentially 2 mana available with our 1 Eldrazi Temple. So yep, that's gonna do it for our board. The Conflagrate's gonna flash back. The prized Amalgam is gonna come into play, and that's gonna set us back pretty significantly. So the draw here was actually a copy of Thought-Knot Seer. And I kind of like running Thought-Knot out so that we can have a blocker for the Amalgam. And it looks like our opponent could still have that Stinkweed Imp in hand. So yeah, let's go ahead and go for the Thought-Knot play. I think I like that. So yep, our opponent does have a Stinkweed Imp and a prized Amalgam. Interesting that our opponent would choose to hold the prized Amalgam there. So what our opponent can do here is dredge an Imp and then cast it. But I think we still take the Imp and pass back. So we're actually playing a bit of a longer, drawn-out game here, which is a little bit unusual. And it looks like our opponent has elected to dredge a copy of Life from the Loam here. And our opponent was pretty lucky to hit another Conflagrate, a Faithless Looting, and a Loam here. So the Loam is going to get 3 lands back. And now our opponent can potentially Conflagrate away the Thought-Knot Seer. And then our opponent would be able to choose how they use that draw off the Thought-Knot. But it looks like actually only 3 cards in hand, so that's not an option available. Sorry about that. And here's a Path to Exile. That's a pretty interesting draw step. So we could just jam Reality Smasher. Another option, though, is to play Leonin Arbiter and Path to Exile. Tough choice, actually. Pretty tough choice. The Path could hit the Prized Amalgam. We could also just play the Smasher, which I think we just want to play the Smasher here. Get it into play. And our opponent isn't going to be able to kill it if we attack with it. They will have the option to chump block with an Amalgam. But it looks like there is going to be no chump block, so our opponent is going to drop down to 9. I feel pretty decent about this, but you never know what is going to get dredged up. And so that's what we're hoping doesn't happen, is our opponent hits something like multiple Narcomoebas, etc. Although it looks like our opponent may have just taken a draw step here, but is now going to dredge a copy of Life from the Loam. And it may be that the plan all along on this turn was to play a Conflagrate. And with the Dredge deck, it's pretty interesting because you want to make sure your deck has enough cards in it so that you can keep dredging throughout the game. In games like this that are going to go long, it may be that our opponent opted to simply draw a card because they already knew what their play was going to be. They want to get the prized amalgam into the graveyard. And it looks like, actually, rather than conflagrating away the Thought Knot, the Reality Smasher is what's going to be targeted with this. And that makes some sense. And now our opponent's going to pass the turn. So, couple options here. But our opponent is on 0 cards. So, I think I like swinging in here for 4. And if our opponent does double block, we just go ahead and cast the Path to Exile on the Prized Amalgam. And if our opponent finds another land, that's not really a huge deal. The Narcomoeba is going to hit the graveyard, and now we can go ahead and deploy this Thalia. I think I like this line rather than playing the other option was to play the Arbiter first. But I think I'd rather be doing this. Now we have the Thalia in play, so something like Narcomoeba is going to come into play tapped, which is really nice. And our opponent actually did find a Narcomoeba here. Or maybe not. That's weird. It may be that the Narcomoeba was discarded last turn. Sorry. But it looks like Life from the Loam is going to get cast. So our opponent may just want to conflagrate away the Thalia. But that's an exchange that we're pretty happy about. And our opponent's already used 2 copies of Conflagrate this game. So we're actually kind of grinding the Dredge deck out, which doesn't happen all that often. But it seems to be happening right now. So there is that Conflagrate. That's the 3rd Conflagrate our opponent's used. And we're untapping now in a pretty good spot. So I like getting in there for 4, definitely, with our Thought Knot. And we can then play our Leonin Arbiter. And just pass. I don't think we need to put the Flicker Wisp into play. We could use that as a blink effect in case our opponent hits multiple creatures here. We can blink one of them out. And it looks like our opponent is just going for a Grave Troll, so perfect. We have a Flicker Wisp in hand, and so we are going to be winning this game. We're just going to simply cast the Flicker Wisp here, blink out that Golgari Grave Troll, and that's going to do it for game 2. So we were able to take the game without drawing Rest in Peace or Relic of Progenitus. So a lot more interesting than game 1, that's for sure. So, looking at the sideboard options, kind of have to choose which direction we want to go in. I think I like still shaving a couple of Aether Vials. Thoughtseize on the draw is a lot worse because you can't get something like an Insolent Neonat. So maybe we do hope to kind of mise our opponent with this Worship and bring it in. And the issue with Worship, though, is that our opponent can very easily conflagrate away our creatures. So it's not the best card, but it's serviceable. And since we're on the draw, I think we can shave one more Vial and potentially even board in a card like Kitchen Finks. Since we have Worship in our deck, I think I like playing both copies of Finks. And we probably don't need the Displacers. So, yep. This seems pretty good. Let's try it. Alright. Here is another one of those hands that seems okay. It's definitely a hand we would keep against a random deck. The question is, do we keep against Dredge? Well, our opponent has taken a mulligan, so that would lead to me wanting to keep this more, actually. It's got lands and spells. Alright. I mean, the Arbiters just aren't the best in this matchup. Thought Knot on turn 4 isn't really where we want to be. I guess we can afford to mulligan this. I think it's pretty close. And now we've got a 1-lander, so basically on the other side of the spectrum. What we do have, though, is a Rest in Peace. So, on the back of that, I would like to keep this. Also, our opponent didn't see any sort of hate, and now we've got a Plains on top. So, happy that we took the mulligan here. Definitely, as we have turn 2 Rest in Peace available to us. And we're almost certainly just going to want to play the Rest in Peace on turn 2. The rest of our hand isn't all that impressive, so we're hoping that our opponent doesn't have a way to get a bunch of creatures in play right now. And we see a Grave Troll got dredged. There is one Bloodghast in the yard. However, not yet seeing a card like Prized Amalgam show up. So that is pretty good news. However, our opponent could have something like Faithless Looting to be able to dig further into their deck. But it looks like that's not what's going to happen. So that's going to allow us to untap here and simply cast this Rest in Peace And that could just be the game. It depends what our opponent's brought in. If our opponent has ways to deal with Rest in Peace, like Abrupt Decay or Nature's Claim. But we are going to be able to stop the Bloodghast. So I think we're in a pretty good spot at the moment. And it looks like our opponent's gone to the phase of hard casting creatures. So we can do the same. I think the first one we want to get into play is Thalia. Our opponent has a Ghost Quarter in play, which is actually a reason not to play Arlene and Arbiter, because we don't want to play our Arbiter, then have our opponent Ghost Quarter away our planes and have no colored source at all. So we can just take the hit here from the Imp. And here's a Raven's Crime. Well, we already have one Thalia in play. Thalia, the new Thalia, we don't have the land for it. Alright, we can discard it. And we definitely wanted to draw a land there. I think we still want to just go ahead and attack with our Thalia. Yep, gonna go ahead and get in there with it. And I think we just go ahead and cast the Path on the Stinkweed Imp. It's a little bit more troublesome than the Bloodghast, even though the Bloodghast threatens to deal us 2. And now we've found Warship, so that's not really the card we wanted to find. So, do we slow down our attacks? I guess we can slow down our attacks. I guess there's no real rush, assuming that we think that our opponent does not have a way to get rid of the Rest in Peace, which they clearly don't have a way to get rid of Rest in Peace in hand at this current moment. And it looks like that's going to do it. So our opponent just didn't have the answer to Rest in Peace, and that's going to do it.